Hi, Brian West here with Virtual Frazier. And today I am going to begin with a letter from Jack Roosevelt Robinson, better known to you as Jackie Robinson, the famous baseball player who broke the color line in Major League Baseball in 1947. And this is a letter that he wrote after his playing years were over to Vice President Richard Nixon in 1958. This is after the time of Brown versus the Board of Education, which was a major Supreme Court decision which effectively struck down laws for segregation in public schools. And so this is in reference to that, among other civil rights legislation which was being put under consideration by Congress in the late 1950s. My dear Mr. Vice President, I read your letter with care and deep concern. While I know that Rome was not built in a day, I think you will agree that I have shown some patience throughout the years with the slow progress made in the field of civil rights. Nevertheless, I am convinced that those of us who are earnestly concerned about the problems of civil rights and integration must measure progress not in terms of how much progress we have made recently, but how far we have yet to go before we achieve full first-class citizenship for the Negro. Until we do give him all the rights to which he is entitled under the Constitution, we cannot hope to successfully forestall the propaganda emanating from those we refer to as non-democratic countries. Moreover, top Negro leadership, which attempts to meet this propaganda, no matter how insincere the basis for this propaganda is, will be repudiated by the Negro masses if they attempt to justify the thought of a quote-unquote breathing spell in the fight for integration at a time the total Negro South and the best elements of the white South are looking to the government for leadership and protection from disaster at the hands of the representatives of the White Citizens Council and white office holders in the South who are determined that the Supreme Court's mandate will not be obeyed in our lifetime. Now, Jackie Robinson was an ardent supporter, or I should say he would become an ardent supporter of Richard Nixon when Nixon ran for the office of President of the United States in 1960. Even after Nixon had lost the general election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, Robinson would still be a supporter of Nixon, even during Nixon's time running for governor of California later on in the 60s. However, by 1964, Robinson became somewhat disillusioned with the Republican Party. There were elements within the Republican Party, especially led by Senator Barry Goldwater, the eventual presidential nominee for the Republicans, to push for more states' rights issues as opposed to civil rights issues. This caused a split within the Republican Party and also caused Robinson to become more disillusioned. As a matter of fact, Robinson would support the Democratic nominee for president in 1964, Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he actually would be part of a committee called Republicans for Johnson during that time. And so I shared a story to establish the context for what happens next in 1964. During that time, civil rights activists here in Kentucky were trying to convince the Kentucky General Assembly to pass legislation which would ban discrimination in public accommodations across the state. Unfortunately for the activists, the General Assembly were slow to act to pass such legislation. The bill was being held up in committee. And so in order to spur on the passing of this bill, organizers wanted to create a march to Frankfort during that time. The person who organized this march was Frank Stanley Jr., who was the editor of the African-American newspaper of Louisville, the Louisville Defender. He was friends with Dr. Martin Luther King, whom he had met during the mid-50s. King, coincidentally, was also a friend of Jackie Robinson. Robinson took a liking to King while King was involved in the Montgomery Boyce boycott of the 1950s. And King and Robinson would also collaborate later on in the early 60s in helping rebuild churches which were burned down, black churches which were burned down in Albany, Georgia in 1962. And so because of these connections, King and Robinson were invited to attend this march on Frankfort. And so the person who was in charge of coordinating the march was Georgia Davis Powers. Now you may recognize her as the first woman senator to be elected to the Kentucky General Assembly. But during this time, she was a community organizer. Before, she had successfully organized the campaign to help get Ned Breathitt elected to the governorship of Kentucky in 1963. However, in 1964, Breathitt was in the midst of dealing with the Public Accommodations Bill, the Civil Rights Bill, which would have made discrimination illegal in public accommodations. And so once the march was organized, King and Robinson arrived to Louisville International Airport, which was known as Stanford Field at the time. Powers arranged for her brother, Louis Montgomery, who was the director of a funeral home in Louisville, to bring a limousine to Stanford Field to pick up King and Robinson. During the ride from Louisville to Frankfort, Robinson sat in the front of the limousine while Powers sat in the back, briefing King on some of the intricacies of the Public Accommodations Bill and its status in the Kentucky General Assembly. Once King and Robinson arrived at Frankfort, they were also met with other civil rights leaders, including King's close confidant, Ralph Abernathy, as well as other organizers. With over 10,000 participants, the participants stood behind King and Robinson and Powers. Eventually, Breathitt had an audience with King and Robinson and Powers, telling them that he was considering the legislation, yet because of his new role as governor, he had to feel his way to see if the bill could be passed in the Kentucky Assembly. Now, unfortunately, the Civil Rights Bill failed to pass in the Kentucky General Assembly in 1964. However, the bill did pass 2 years later in the Kentucky General Assembly in 1966. And this was really a watershed moment for Kentucky because the state was the first state in the South to pass civil rights legislation which forbid discrimination in public accommodations in the entire South. So to conclude, I just want to share a brief little story about Robinson, which occurred in New York City. During the early 1960s, Robinson was a writer for the New York Amsterdam News, which was, well, still is, a leading black newspaper in New York City, one of the oldest, in fact, in the United States. And at the time, Robinson wrote an article which was critical of the then Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, who represented Harlem at the time. And so Robinson took issue with the fact that Powell was supportive of the activist Malcolm X, who emphasized defense and separatism against for blacks from whites. And so Robinson also took issue with the fact that Powell was critical of the NAACP, an organization which Robinson wholeheartedly supported ever since his retirement from Major League Baseball. And so he wrote a letter to Powell, which wasn't received too well by the readers of the New York Amsterdam News. Another one, here's a passage from a reader who wrote a letter to the editor in reference to Robinson's articles. Towards the end of your baseball career, you stirred up quite a number of white people as a result of your aggressiveness and your tendency to assert your rights as an individual. Of course, by acting thusly, you as a Negro were not playing the role that white American society naturally expected of you as a Negro. Judging by your remarks and your effort to get Adam Powell to see the error of his ways, you are departing from your Negro militancy, which has been so prevalent in your weekly column in the Amsterdam News. And so, as a response, Robinson wrote, if sticking together means you continue to blindly endorse a man simply because he is black or green or white, when you truly feel he has been wrong, you can have that kind of sticking together. One of the most precious assets a man has is his right to speak the truth as he sees it. Well, that concludes my video for Virtual Frazier. If you're more interested in learning more about Jackie Robinson and his political convictions, you could do worse than to check out this book, First Class Citizenship, The Civil Rights Letters of Jackie Robinson. The editor is Michael G. Long. Also, if you want to learn more about Jackie Robinson and Georgia Davis Powers and Martin Luther King Jr., please visit our exhibit on site at the Frazier, Kentucky History Museum called What's a Vote Worth? There you will learn more about civil rights as well as the fight for women's suffrage. Otherwise, on behalf of the staff and crew at Virtual Frazier, I want to thank y'all for watching this video. And in the meantime, stay safe. And for you baseball fans out there, play ball!